This is session 2, which is an introduction to disaster risk management. The objectives of the session are, first, to present the basic concepts of disaster, which are hazard, disaster, vulnerability, capacity, and disaster risk. We will also look into another new idea called exposure. Second, we will describe disaster risk management, which is a process. And third, we will describe the risk profile of the Asia-Pacific region. So let's begin with describing disasters. A disaster is a serious disruption or interruption of the functioning of a society or a community. It involves widespread deaths, illness, material, economic, or environmental loss and impact. This will exceed the ability of the affected community or people to cope using its own resource. So what we have here is a very serious situation. So serious that people are unable to cope on their own. Now let's compare it with the description of a hazard. A hazard is a dangerous phenomenon, substance, human activity, or condition. It may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impacts. It may cause property damage, loss of livelihoods and services, social and economic disruption, or environmental damage. In other words, a hazard is not a disaster, but it can trigger a disaster. Just because an earthquake has struck or a typhoon has passed through does not mean that we have to have a disaster. It will lead to disaster if we are not prepared for it. Let's look at the categories of hazards. We have 3 general types: natural, technological, and environmental degradation. The natural hazard category is further subdivided into 3. We have what we call hydrometeorological hazards. These will include typhoons, also known as tropical cyclones, storm surge, wind, rain, blizzard, lightning, drought, storms, temperature extreme, flood, landslides, and avalanche. The second subcategory is geological. This will include earthquakes and then volcanic eruptions. The third category is biological, and these are caused by bacteria, hazards, pest infestation. Okay, now for technological, we have industrial accidents and pollution, radioactivity, toxic waste, dam failure, vehicular accidents, explosions, fires, and spills, chemical spills. And for environmental degradation, we have deforestation, desertification, wildland fires, and the loss of biodiversity. These are just some of the examples of the various categories of hazards. As I said, these are not disasters yet, but they may trigger the disaster. So now we will look at the other components that can lead to a disaster. We have what we call exposure. This is when we have people, property, systems, or other elements that are present in hazard zones. They have to be present in a zone where a hazard may occur, and therefore they will be subject to potential loss. If we look at the 2 photos in the slide, one photo shows a very poor settlement made of unsafe materials, and the second photo at the bottom shows a very well-built set of apartment buildings. But they are both next to bodies of water, and these bodies of water, let's say they are both rivers. That means they are both exposed to the potential rise of a river and the damage that flooding may occur. So no matter what kind of settlement we're talking about, if they are both present at an area where a hazard may occur, then they are both exposed to the hazard. Okay, so this is a critical element. As disaster risk managers, we try to reduce exposure, to move people, livelihoods, and settlements out of the way where a hazard may occur. Third is the concept of vulnerability. These are the characteristics and circumstances of a community, system, or asset that make it susceptible to the damaging effects of a hazard. Just as a paper may burn, just as a plastic pen may melt, just as a person can fall ill from poor nutrition, that means we can all be damaged and we can all be destroyed. There is something inside us, something intrinsic that makes us vulnerable to certain things. As a person, I will be vulnerable to a flood if I cannot swim and I am in over my head in moving water. As a person, I may be vulnerable to an earthquake if I am standing within a structure and there are things that can fall on top of my head while an earthquake is occurring. So this means that I am, in my nature, weak to certain kinds of hazards. But as a person, I may also be stronger against it. If I learn how to swim, then I stand a better chance of surviving a flood. If I wear a protective helmet on my head, I stand a better chance of surviving an earthquake that hits a building. This means that even though we are originally vulnerable, we can do things to protect ourselves. Vulnerability also changes with time, with age. A pregnant woman is more vulnerable than after she has given birth. A child who is not taught to protect himself or herself is more vulnerable than a child who later on learns in school how to swim, how to duck and cover if there's an earthquake, how to evacuate from the school building if there's a fire. So vulnerability can change over time. But even if I'm trained in all of this, if I grow old and I become feeble, or if I become infirm and I cannot run as fast as I used to, or swim as fast as I used to, or perhaps I become disoriented because of my age, then I am again vulnerable. So vulnerability is a social characteristic, and it's an intrinsic biological characteristic, and it changes over time, and it's something that we are constantly supposed to monitor. Now we look at the concept of capacity. This refers to the combination of all the strengths, attributes, and resources that are available within a community, within an organization, within a society. And these can be used to achieve agreed goals in order to reduce disaster risk and be prepared for disaster events. So if we look at the image, we can see there are people dressed in orange. They are practicing for conducting rescue in a river. So this is part of capacity. This is disaster preparedness. These are skills in search and rescue that we can learn so that we can help save each other. Just as in schools we teach children to cover their heads during an earthquake and duck under their tables, or we teach them how to file in an orderly manner and evacuate following their teacher if the fire bell alarm sounds off. We can raise the capacity of every organization, every community, until an entire nation is full of people who are trained to know what to do whenever there is a particular event that is happening that can threaten their survival. So capacity is a positive aspect in disaster risk management. So this brings me to the concept of disaster risk itself. If you look at it as an equation, it is a function of the kind of hazards that we are looking at, how severe it is, how frequent does it happen. It is a function of our exposure. Are we immediately in the way of the hazard, or are we further away from the hazard? It is a function of the vulnerability of the society, of the elements of the society, and it's a function of our capacity. Therefore, if we put it all together, it is a potential in terms of disaster loss, lives, health status, livelihoods, assets, and services, which could occur to a particular community or society over a specified period of time. So you can look at it as a probability. Sometimes it is expressed as a probability, but it is actually a potential. The next slide shows a way in which it can be expressed as an equation where you have hazard and vulnerability on the top, on the numerator. That means the greater the degree of hazard and the greater the frequency, and even the greater the exposure to the hazard, then the higher the risk of disaster. The more vulnerable is a person or a community or a country, then the greater the risk of disaster. However, as a denominator, we have capacity. This means the more capacity we have to respond to a disaster, to recover from a disaster, to mitigate the disaster, then the lower the risk of disaster. So this equation is not meant to be taken literally. It is just a way of organizing our ideas about how to reduce the chances that a disaster may occur in your community and in your country. Disaster risk management is therefore a process of using administrative directives, organizations, operational skills, and capacities to implement strategies, policies, and improve coping capacities in order to lessen the adverse impacts of hazards and the possibility of a disaster. So this is a process that it requires coordination of many organizations, both within and external to government. This slide shows the phases of disaster risk management. There are 4 phases and they are non-sequential. Rather, they occur usually simultaneously. We encourage that we look at the different phases and be prepared for each phase. So in the mitigation phase, here we try to lessen or limit the adverse impacts of hazards and related disasters. If you are studying engineering and you are learning proper engineering techniques and you are learning how to keep your building safe, then you are part of mitigation. In preparedness, this is the knowledge and capacity set that we develop in order to anticipate, respond to, recover from the impacts of a likely disaster. Okay, so then here we set up, for example, volunteer groups who can do search and rescue and perform first aid. Here we set up evacuation centers. We set up evacuation routes from homes and workplaces to evacuation shelters. And we have a disaster preparedness plan. Disaster response. This is the provision of emergency services and public assistance during or immediately after a disaster has started. This is done in order to save lives, reduce health impacts, ensure public safety, and meet the basic subsistence needs of the people who are affected. Preparedness and response are 2 sides of the same coin. Whatever you have planned for under preparedness, you execute in response. And the quality of response will be greatly improved by the amount that you have prepared. Finally, we have recovery. Recovery is the restoration and improvement of facilities, livelihoods, living conditions of those who are affected by disasters. And this includes efforts to reduce disaster risk factors. That means if after an earthquake has struck and communities are leveled, their houses, their places of work are destroyed, roads are destroyed, infrastructure are destroyed, utilities are destroyed, then we need a process of recovery to start rebuilding. Rebuilding infrastructure, rebuilding buildings, and hopefully rebuilding lives and livelihoods. In the center is a concept called disaster risk reduction. This is an approach where we reduce disaster risks through efforts to analyze and manage the causal factors of disasters, including reducing exposure to hazards and lessening vulnerability. That means we will tackle difficult problems such as evacuating people from very, very unsafe zones to safe zones. This includes looking at factors of poverty and poor education in order to raise the capacity of the ordinary person to respond to a disaster and cope, and then later on recover and be even stronger after an event. Now we are looking at a slide which shows a figure with a yellow line. That is supposed to be a development trajectory. If we assume that we are doing things right in our society, then we are continuously progressing along this yellow line, going upward, right? However, if a disaster happens, then this development is interrupted by an event. And then our level of development usually goes down during a disaster. And so we have to undertake efforts to be able to climb out of the problem and go back to our previous development track, or even improve on our development track if certain development activities led to creating disaster risk. Then going better, building back better, living better means we avoid whatever we were doing in the past that was wrong. So disaster mitigation and disaster preparedness are done simultaneously during the development phase. In the event of the disaster response dominates the disaster risk management phase. And then afterwards, during disaster recovery, that is the process of climbing back into the regular development phase. So the role of ICT in disaster risk management is in terms of enhancing the compilation, dissemination, and use of disaster risk reduction information. It is best if this information is used during the phase of disaster mitigation and disaster preparedness, but also during regular development activity. So I would like to have some points to remember that for you to keep in mind, and then after this we will look at the disaster profile of the Asia-Pacific region. So first, remember that hazard does not equal to disaster. Second, hazards alone do not lead to disasters. Third, when the occurrence of a hazard interacts with vulnerabilities, disaster may result. So now we are looking at a paradigm shift from emergency response to disaster risk management so that we can lower vulnerabilities and reduce exposure to hazards. Finally, let us look at the disaster profile of the Asia-Pacific region. The graphs you will see are taken from the Prevention website. This first graph shows the recorded disaster events that have occurred in Asia. This is for the period 1980 to 2008. So most of the events have hydrometeorological triggers. You can see that the blue shading is very, very much higher than the pink and the purple. So the second most frequent are geological triggered disasters, followed by biological triggered disasters. We can also see that over time, the frequency of occurrence of hydrometeorological disasters have been increasing. The next figure is a pie chart showing in what type of disasters have more people been killed. For the period 1980 to 2008, 48% of deaths are during earthquake disasters. And the second leading cause of deaths during disasters are storms such as typhoons or tropical cyclones at 33.5%. Finally, in terms of damages for the same time period, this bar graph shows that earthquakes and floods have both produced the most damage at close to $250 billion each. So I hope you have found this session interesting, and I look forward to guiding you through the rest of the primer. Thank you.